Well, good afternoon, and thank you so much for having me. Charlie, thank you for hosting this fabulous event in Siri, which is a fabulous place. I've learned because I got to spend 2 days ago with many of the researchers and entrepreneurs, aspiring and budding entrepreneurs here. It is a very cool and exciting place, and I hope you have a chance to meet some of the very smart people who are here. And Ron, thank you for bringing me to Perth, Western Australia. I want you to know that coming from the other side of the world, I can tell you that Mannkal punches way above its weight in terms of influence and impact. So thank you for your support of Mannkal, and realize that you're getting a good ROI on your investment as these young people go off into the world. Well, I'm not an academician, I'm not a scholar, I am a serial entrepreneur in Silicon Valley who has had to deal firsthand with regulations and law. And that experience over the last 25 years has built my interest, deep interest in the subject. And it's from that foundation that I'll be talking about Western civilization in Silicon Valley with you tonight. My talk has two parts. One is how Western civilization has enabled Silicon Valley, and two is some thoughts on how we can all help create Silicon Valleys in Western Australia. All right. Well, first of all, what has Western civilization contributed to modern history and life? Well, a great deal, as you know, and as we've heard from our wonderful speakers today. The Renaissance, Reformation, Scientific Revolution, the Enlightenment, Industrial Revolution, liberal democracies, all the way up through the electronic and information ages. But the aspect of Western civilization that I'd like to focus on, that I think is grossly underappreciated, and which Bella alluded to briefly in her remarks, and Bella, thank you so much for setting me up, is British common law. Humble British common law, I think, is the linchpin for many of these and for Silicon Valley ultimately. Let me explain. First of all, just to refresh your memory, common law originated in medieval England. It started with the Magna Carta, which limited the rights of the crown initially over barons, provided for their private property, no taxation without representation, juries of peers. It was only later extended and demanded by commodores and extended to everyone. Sometimes referred to as judge-made law. Common law is very modest. It only exists to resolve disputes, which of course inevitably do and will arise between people. And so if there's no dispute, there's no law needed. Common law is very economical. It doesn't try to anticipate and predict all the issues or problems or concerns that might arise in the future. Just addresses them as they arise. Makes use of the reasonable man or person notion, which is to resolve this dispute, what would seem reasonable to a reasonable person? And so you can see that common law is inextricably tied to the culture and the customs of an area. And it reinforces and co-evolves with those. It's uncodified. It only exists in the many decisions that have been handed down over the years, decades and years. It evolves as cases are decided, and it doesn't provide hard and fast rules, but rather guidance and standards. So that's common law, and of course the former British colonies, including all of the countries that are listed here, have inherited common law traditions. So that's common law, and to pinpoint exactly further what I mean by that, let me distinguish it from the other primary legal tradition in the world, or in Western civilization, which is continental civil law. Those are statutes, regulations, executive orders. These originate not from the British Isles, but from the continent. Roman emperors and legislators provided rules for judges to follow. Civil law got a big boost in the early 19th century from Napoleon, who codified a law which brought a lot of clarity and consistency and nullified a previous law, and reinforced the notion that judges could only apply the law, not interpret it or make new law. And this was one of the tools, of course, that Napoleon used to consolidate power. Judges were disempowered from finding better resolutions. If two litigants had a better solution, but it was contrary to civil law, they couldn't adopt it. Civil law became the legal regime of choice for most politicians worldwide. And as we'll see on the next slide, most of the world outside of the former British colonies have primarily adopted civil law. Every country in the world uses a combination of both. Civil law has been called policy implementing as opposed to dispute resolving. And interestingly, England, according to Ponzetto, had legislation since the Middle Ages, but before the 20th century was reluctant to use it and used it only sparingly. So common law had a real chance to establish a foothold there. So France, Spain, Germany all adopted inherited civil law traditions, and their former colonies, most of Latin America, North Africa, Asia, have primarily civil law traditions. Just to be very clear, civil law is used in two different ways. It can refer to non-criminal law, in which case it's distinguished from criminal law, or it can mean legislative, statutory, or administrative law and regulations, in which case it's distinguished from common law, and of course it's in this second sense that we're using the word today. Here's another way to think of it. Think of these cubes as the space of everything that people can do, or that they can conceive of doing at any particular point in time. Well, common law on the left specifies what cannot be done. It presumes freedom and rights of individuals. Civil law specifies what is allowed and presumes that rights and freedoms are granted by the state. Now think about what happens as an innovation happens. The number of dimensions of that cube increase from a few million to many millions to billions, trillions, and so forth. But what happens if you've adopted civil law? It doesn't know how to deal with those additional dimensions. And that's one of the reasons, as we'll see, that civil law traditions inhibit innovation. Let's see how common law and civil law evolve. Common law continuously through real-world cases. Many decisions take place in parallel throughout the land, so there's variation in selection. So evolution, it evolves with the society, the economy, and technology. It's been referred to as a structure without design. It is not designed from the top down. It evolves just as in evolution in nature. In contrast, civil law is defined at fixed points in times when legislators or regulators define the law, when it's drafted, vetted, and enacted, and when it's periodically revised or not revised, as it may not be if people want to keep it in place. As a result, studies have shown, and I cite them in a paper that I will share with you in a moment, common law is less predictable short term because you never know exactly how a judge or jury may decide a certain case, but it's more predictable in the long term because huge changes in law are not going to happen with common law as they do overnight, as they do with civil law. For example, when in the U.S. Sarbanes-Oxley or the so-called Affordable Care Act went into place, huge changes overnight. And so civil law is more predictable in the short term, but less predictable in the long term, and that gives rise to regime uncertainty. Common law has been called organic. Nassim Taleb, looks like I just lost power. Want me to use that? Nicholas Nassim Taleb, the financial writer, refers to it as anti-fragile, as compared to civil law, which is designed or imposed. Well, let's look at current status today. Well, all countries today use a mix of both traditions. Civil law can be more practical and efficient and scalable, able to handle a larger population when cases are numerous. It's similar for public goods and commons when property rights are not well defined, as in air pollution or national defense. And in these cases, it's more practical than having judges handle cases case by case. Civil law is often simply common law codified at a specific point in time, and that's a good thing, because the good thing is that the civil law is based on the common law. Common law gives you a chance to experiment, learn, see what works, and so forth. And what's ideal, if you're going to have civil law to take advantages of the economies of scale, let it be based on common law that it has had some time to cook. So in the U.S., criminal statutes in most U.S. states are based on civil law, common law. Throughout the 20th century, the U.S. gradually shifted from being primarily common law based to primarily statutory or civil law based as a primary source of law, and sadly, civil law is increasingly supplanting common law everywhere. Now, to give a clearer example of how either civil law or common law might be used to handle a specific situation, let's look at drones. We all know the applications of drones. There are many: deliveries, farming, construction, and so forth. And there are also real risks of drones. They can fall, they can collide, they can, if they're carrying cameras, they can intrude on your privacy. Now, how are drones currently regulated in the U.S.? Well, through a large number of regulations from the Federal Aviation Administration. They can only be well away from airports, only up to 400 feet in altitude, only with visual sight of operators, only one operator per drone, only during daylight hours. In effect, this means they're for non-commercial purposes unless you get an exemption. What are the innovations that all of those laws preclude? Well, there's no incentive then for the drone to recognize another airborne object, to be able to extrapolate the position of another object to avoid it, or for drones to communicate with each other. No incentives at all to develop those technologies if you have to have a dedicated operator. What's the outcome of all this? Well, the outcome is the top drone manufacturer worldwide is in China. DJI Technology owns 2/3 of the U.S. market, over $1,000. The number 2 vendor, 3D Robotics, recently went out of the hardware business and now just makes software. Now, this is really unnecessary because there are already common laws on the books that could be extended to drones. It has long been illegal, or an owner of a dangerous animal has long been held responsible for the behavior and actions of that animal. And it's the owner's responsibility for controlling and restraining the animal to protect life and property. Similarly, for drones that carry cameras, there have long been, for centuries, peeping Tom laws on the books. It's illegal to secretly peep into a room occupied by another person or to secretly photograph or video the person in that room. These laws could very naturally be extended to encompass drones with or without cameras. So that shows you how common law could be used to apply to even a very new technology like drones. Let me talk about some of the benefits and costs of each of the two different types of regulation, civil law and common law. First, I think most of us here are familiar with the term public choice concerns. They're factors unrelated to public welfare that influence law and legislation. They're either to protect politically favored industries, or to generate revenue for agencies, or to insulate bureaucratic agencies from risk. Well, here are just a whole bunch of examples of public choice concerns that don't benefit the people of a society, but that benefit either selected groups or reduce risk for a agency. So these are all examples of how, because you have a single decision-making body in a legislature or a parliament, civil law invites this kind of concern. But if you have decisions being made throughout the land through lots of courts of law, you don't have an opportunity for this kind of thing. Civil law can also lead to unintended consequences. We've seen with the so-called Affordable Care Act, full-time employees are being converted to part-time because to meet the requirements of the law. That's bad for both the employers and the employees. Minimum wages incentivize the use of automation and robots. Rent control means there's less incentive for new housing to be built and means that housing is lower quality. High taxes on alcohol and cigarettes lead to black markets. So all of this ultimately results from the attempt to implement policy through law. Let me talk about the impact on entrepreneurship and innovation. So law regulations also deter those. And which law is the biggest obstacle depends upon what industry you're in. Here are some examples from the U.S. There's sadly no silver bullet, and so it's a tough situation to address, because even if you avoid one regulation, you're likely to run into others. Think of any measure of entrepreneurial effectiveness that you can think of. It's probably overall effectiveness of an entrepreneur might be a composite of the person's education, ambition, passion, perseverance, resources, and so forth. No matter what index you come up with, there will probably be a distribution of entrepreneurs along some curve, maybe a bell-shaped curve like this one. Well, no matter what index you come up with, no matter how you define it, there will be some number of entrepreneurs at the low end, in particular, of your index who are being thwarted by regulation. More and more entrepreneurs are being blocked each decade. This is a study which I cite, which shows the number of new companies created for every 10,000 working age Americans in the U.S., and you can see that it is steadily declining decade to decade. So more entrepreneurs are being blocked each decade. Here's another way to think about it. Civil law regulations turn what should be a highly positive environment into negative-sum environments. This huge space might be pharmaceuticals, aviation, building construction, food distribution, and so forth. But there are relatively few entrepreneurs and startups in those areas. They are disallowed opportunities for innovation. In contrast, there are over 100,000 startups squeezed into this tiny box, the health and fitness mobile app space. Well, why so many up there and so few in this much larger, huger market opportunity? Well, wittingly or unwittingly, entrepreneurs gravitate to the least regulated industries and markets. And that turns what should be a highly positive sum environment, where people are not directly competing with each other, but each going in their own direction and satisfying their own customer needs, into a very zero-sum or negative-sum environment where they are directly competing. Most of them will not survive. If just a few of those startups in the health and fitness mobile app space could be freed up to work in all of these other industries, technology and humanity would advance at a much faster pace. Finally, common law correlates with economic growth. A number of studies have shown this is probably the best known one, economic consequences of legal origins. Schleifer is a well-known and highly cited professor at Harvard. All of these benefits are associated in society with greater use of common law rather than civil law. And this study shows that more than 0.5% per year greater growth in GDP per capita is enjoyed by common law countries, primarily common law countries than civil law countries. So remember that more than 0.5% per year greater growth in GDP. I'm going to use it right here. So here's North America and South America, and according to the International Monetary Fund, per capita income is about 37,000 here, 8,000 here in South America. Well, that's a factor of 4.4 difference in per capita income between North America and South America. Of course, North America has primarily inherited common law traditions from in Canada and the United States, and South America primarily civil law traditions from Spain. Well, remember that slightly more than 0.5% per year growth that I talked about? Well, that's about what 1.006 is, isn't it? Slightly more than 0.5%. If you raise that to the 250th power, i.e. compound that growth rate over the last 2.5 centuries, then you get, since approximately the founding of or the American Revolution, you get roughly the same factor. So the numbers hang together. Botswana was the fastest growing economy in the world from 1965 to 1995, averaging 7.7% growth per year. Why? Well, it inherited not one, but two forms of common law, British common law and its own tribal law. It was a British protectorate after 1885, but Britain managed the area, ruled the area very lightly and gave stature to its tribal law, and then it gained independence in 1966. And then finally, Silicon Valley. All of the innovation that we see in Silicon Valley today, with familiar names like these, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Intel, Adobe, HP, Oracle, and so forth, have flourished and blossomed thanks to, in my view, to common law. Silicon Valley is over a century old. Most people don't realize how old it is and how long it has been in existence. But the first spin out of a technology company actually happened in 1910. Stanford was a key facilitator. No one could have predicted way back then that wireless radio would give rise to vacuum tubes, which would give rise to instruments and semiconductors and mini computers and PCs, biotech, networking, mobile devices, and so forth, all the way up to AI and autonomous vehicles today. There is no way we could have anticipated how Silicon Valley was going to evolve. At most, maybe you can anticipate it 3 years from now. That's about it. So there's no way great use of civil law would have enabled this. So to conclude this first half, what can we say about statutes? Let them reflect common law. Let them take advantage of the experimentation and learning and discovery that happens under common law. Don't put statutes in place until there is some history of cases that have been resolved by courts so we can see what works and what doesn't work. Make them responsive, not prescriptive. Focus on objectives, not specifications. Cars in the U.S. have to have 3 rear view mirrors, one on either side and one on the middle. And yet now we're having cameras which obviate that. It's going to be really hard to get rid of those 3 rear view mirrors, even if people someday soon don't use them. So don't focus on the specifications, focus on the objective. The objective is operate the vehicle. The vehicle must operate safely. Start general and evolve to reflect court cases and norms. So drones today a law might be simply operate safely. 5 years from now, there might well be a requirement that say drones have to be able to recognize and other drones and avoid them as that technology becomes widely used. And provide large spaces for learning and freedom. Let there be 100 vertical feet or meters of space where drones are relatively unconstrained and we can learn what kinds of things they can do, and they have a lot of freedom to experiment. And then for any new drone, any new statute or regulation, here are some principles. Bound its applicability, limit the number of words and pages. If it's more than about 100 pages, people aren't even going to read them, and we won't even know what the unintended consequences are. Create regulation-free zones. You know how we require environmental impact assessments? How about innovation impact assessments? Whenever there's a new regulation, what impact might this have on innovation? And I could go on and on. I have an article here that in the International Journal of Entrepreneurship and Small Business. The URL is here. You can download it free of charge. I'll pass it around. But it goes into much more detail on these ideas. Now, how can we create a Silicon Valley in Western Australia? Well, first, let's consider some thoughts about Silicon Valley. We've seen that companies spin out from trade, position themselves, and compete with each other. That is, all of these companies self-organize with each other. Key point, for each success that we hear all about, there are many, many failures. Each of those failures is an experiment in which learning took place. And that's an essential part of the success. The successes large and small are good because together they drive regional economic growth and distribute wealth broadly. But neither the winning companies nor even industries can be accurately predicted. Most VCs, even the most successful ones, get one or two companies right in their portfolio. And they're strictly focused on return on investment. They're not trying to achieve any political or social objectives like increase the use of green energy or whatever. When political and social objectives intrude on decision-making in venture capital, we've seen how it leads to disastrous results. Probably the best known example in the US is Solyndra. Has anyone heard of Solyndra? A solar energy company in which the state of California and the US Department of Energy invested $550 million before the company went bankrupt. None of it was retrieved. So that's a key point. And finally, don't expect to create a Silicon Valley overnight because, as we've seen, it's over a century old. And we have to think about the long term rather than the short term. So before I say what I think might be good things to consider, let me talk about where I'm slightly dismissive. Most political leaders, in order to promote entrepreneurship in a region, focus on things like elevator pitch competitions and business plan pitch competitions, and short-term tax incentives, and trying to figure out what industries are going to be most successful here and going out of our way to incentivize those. Well, I've participated in all of these things. I've been a judge in competitions. I've been a cheerleader at events like these, and I think they may have some good in terms of PR and building awareness, but I don't think it's where the real work lies. The benefits are primarily short-term in PR, and the real hard work is creating lower tax and friendlier regulatory environments that attract more entrepreneurs from all over the country or all over the world to your region. So I call this entrepreneurship theater. Here's a model I would use instead, or offer instead. Think of how the attractiveness of the economic environment for entrepreneurship drives both the flow of entrepreneurs into or out of the region, and both of those together drive the long-term economic growth, innovation, and standards of living of the region. So let's look at each of those in turn. First, I'm going to focus on this one, which is the net flow of entrepreneurs into or out of the region. So I think a metric that's very worthwhile for Western Australia to monitor, try to measure and monitor, is what is the flow of entrepreneurs into and out of the region. If you want to normalize it to compare different regions with each other, you can do that by dividing by the number of entrepreneurs who stay in the region for some number of years. I don't know what this ratio is. I haven't seen the numbers. I don't even know if I did. We had a good meeting with the Chamber of Commerce here in Western Australia a few days ago. And one surrogate that can be used are things like the number of new building starts. And of course, you can also monitor the net flow of people, some subset of which are entrepreneurs. Anyway, won't get into how it's done, but there are lots of approaches, and whatever metric you use, I think it's one well worth monitoring. Now, incidentally, how is Silicon Valley itself doing on this metric? Well, the answer is not that well. So-so. These are the top 10 U.S. state-to-state migration flows from 2010 to 11, which is the most recent year that I could get data from. And it turns out 4 of the top 10 flows are out of California. Only the smallest is into California from Texas. And if you look more specifically at the 2 counties that comprise Silicon Valley, namely Santa Clara and San Mateo counties, the red bars are net migration flows from overseas. You can see that's roughly constant. And the orange ones are the domestic people who are entering or leaving Silicon Valley. And you can see that it's increasingly negative here in the recent years, despite a strong economy in Silicon Valley that we're enjoying right now. So, and usually it only goes negative when it's a down economy, but right now it's going negative in a strong economy. And where are they going? Well, the number 1 destination is Texas, and in particular these 4 cities in Texas. Now, what is it that makes Texas more attractive to Californians than California? Well, for one thing, there's no state income tax in Texas. Texas is one of only 7 U.S. states without a state income tax. In contrast, California has one of the highest state income taxes of 13.3%. Lower cost of living, friendly regulatory environment, lower cost workforce. So quite possibly, the name of this talk should be how to create a Texas in Western Australia than Silicon Valley, and I think in many ways Texas is a better model to emulate than Silicon Valley nowadays. Now, the second part of this model is the attractiveness of the economic environment for entrepreneurship, and one tool that we have for that is, of course, the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index. Australia ranks here at number 14 this year. And the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index gives you a roadmap for where you need to focus to improve your attractiveness as an environment. The overall metric is a composite of these dozen or so different submetrics. How easy is it to start a business, to deal with construction permits, get electricity, and so forth. And it tells you how you rank relative to 190 different countries or regions, where 1 is the best and 190 is the worst. So you can see trading across borders, surprisingly, we don't do that well on at all for Australia. This is Australia overall, but on enforcing contracts, we're one of the very best. So here's one thing I would suggest, and that I suggest this to any country, and I've given this talk in many countries around the world. No matter where you rank on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index, cut your rank in half in the next 5 years. If you're currently at 14, your goal could be to be number 7. This is a very measurable, aggressive, but achievable goal. Countries move by 1 or 2 positions without even doing anything. If you make this a concerted effort to do it, you can cut your rank in half in 5 years. So that's one thought. Now let's go back to California and Texas. How well are they doing on this metric? Well, not so well. California is number 49 out of 50 on the Cato Freedom of the 50 States, which is roughly comparable to the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index at the U.S. state level rather than at the global country level. And if you look at Texas, they're at number 28. Let's see who's at number 1. New Hampshire. Now, why is New Hampshire number 1 in terms of attractiveness in the economic environment? Well, these are some of the initiatives they've put in place over the last year or two. They've put in these business tax cuts. They have further tax cuts coming up. They've eliminated 1,600 mostly obsolete regulations. And since the tax cuts have gone into effect, tax revenues have actually increased by 16.5%. And employment is rising by 2,000 workers per month before tax cuts. Just New Hampshire, in case you may not be familiar with it, is the state immediately north of Massachusetts on the Atlantic coast. In addition to these economic freedoms, they've also put in place a number of personal freedoms, the ones listed here. These might be additional impacts on entrepreneurship, employment, and economic growth as well as the other ones. So maybe the name of this talk should be How to Create a New Hampshire in Western Australia. In any event, for Western Australia, aim for the lowest tax rates in the world, the lightest regulation in the world, and most efficient administration. Right now, throughout the world, many entrepreneurs are saying, gosh, where we really want to be is in Silicon Valley. What would it take to get them to say, gosh, where we really want to be is in Western Australia? Well, doing these things can help change that perception and get them saying those things. Don't try to pick and attract winners. Ecosystems emerge and evolve continuously. They are not designed from the top down, as we've seen. There's no way we could have predicted 5 years ago what's happening even today in any useful way in Silicon Valley. Create an attractive environment for all entrepreneurs and industries. And as we've seen, it takes a long time. So you have to adopt and promote patience and a long-term point of view. And that's really hard, to stay the course. But we just need to enforce and reinforce that view every opportunity we have, and how entrepreneurs are not going to move if they think it's just a short-term benefit that they're going to get. They want to make sure that it's a long-term benefit, and because they're making a big commitment, and we've got a chicken and egg effect that we need to work hard to get going, and so it's not something we want to play with and mess around with. So don't try to emulate Silicon Valley or even Texas or New Hampshire, but be the best and freest that you can be. So thank you